I am Dr. Riley Hartman, Chief of Emergency Surgery at Mercy Ridge in Pennsylvania. And an hour ago, the trauma pager dragged me out of a chart review into a case I never should have touched. The nurse handed me the intake tablet while mentioning the patient was crashing fast. And the name at the top, Morgan Hartman, 35. Blunt chest trauma hit so sharply I had to steady my grip as I told her to bring the gurney straight to Bay 4. I stepped closer to confirm the ID and saw a folded note, half-slipped from Morgan's jacket pocket with my parents' number scrawled under the words "Call only if necessary." And the room felt smaller as the monitor alarms drew closer behind the paramedics. They pushed her through the sliding doors while asking who would take lead, and I heard myself say "I will" before anyone else breathed, the words rolling out with the training that overrode the history pulsing in my ears. My resident asked whether I needed a second attending because of the name match, and I answered that the only thing that mattered right now was that she had lost a dangerous volume of blood and didn't have minutes to spare. Morgan's pulse thudded weakly under my gloved fingers as I checked for responsiveness, and the pocket note brushed the floor when a nurse lifted her coat, its ink stark and fresh, as if the message had been written on the drive that ended here. The paramedics listed the rollover, the probable splenic rupture, and the fading pressure we needed to reverse before she coded. And I gave the order to prep for an immediate transfer to the OR while asking for cross-matched units on standby. Someone asked whether the family had been notified, and I said they would be, though the truth was still sitting on the tile between my shoes where the note had landed. The doors swung open toward the operating wing as the team moved around me, and the only clear thought I carried with me was that this was the exact moment the past had decided to force its way onto my table. Richard stood in the kitchen with the printout Morgan had slid across the table, and the way he pointed at it while telling me "you walked away from your program" felt like a verdict being handed down before I was allowed a breath. Especially when Linda whispered that they couldn't keep pretending everything was fine if I'd been hiding something this serious. I told them the document was fake, and the timeline made no sense. But Morgan leaned back in her chair with a calm little line about how she wished it weren't true, and how she only shared it because someone had to protect this family. The room locked around that sentence the moment Richard ordered me to stop creating stories, and insisted that if I wanted to be believed, I should explain why faculty emails showed a withdrawal that he claimed matched what Morgan had already shown them. I reached for the folder that held my enrollment letter, and Richard pushed it aside while repeating that he didn't want more excuses because the truth had already been established. And the speed with which he shut the drawer told me he'd made his decision before I entered the room. Linda tried to soften it by mentioning that Morgan had always kept them informed and that they just wanted clarity. And I answered that clarity required them to stop listening to a narrative built on pieces they hadn't verified. Morgan folded her arms with a quiet line about how denial only makes things harder, and the look Richard gave her was the same look he used to give me when he believed he was choosing the reasonable child. I tried one last time, explaining that my program director could confirm everything within minutes. Yet Richard told me not to call anyone because he couldn't stomach another performance. And Linda added that she needed honesty, not documentation. Morgan murmured that she knew this was painful for me, but she hoped I'd eventually face reality. And Richard ended it with a flat, "We need space until you're ready to tell the truth." By the time I stepped outside, my phone vibrated with a message from their number marked blocked contact, and the envelope returning my last letter arrived 2 days later with Linda's handwriting tight across the front. I moved from Massachusetts to Pennsylvania with a stack of loan documents and a schedule that left no room for anything except rebuilding, and Dr. Helena Ward caught me after a 16-hour shift to mention that determination like mine tends to outlast the noise, her hand resting lightly on the chart I had just finished correcting because the numbers hadn't matched earlier. I told her I didn't have much left besides work, and she answered that having work you refuse to abandon is more than most people start with. The kind of line that stayed with me through the next winter rotation. I walked home that night knowing the silence in my apartment felt different after someone recognized the effort behind every page of the residency log I kept refusing to fall behind on. Money was tight enough that I picked up every research hour available. And Dr. Ward stopped me one evening to ask why I hadn't applied for the internal grant when she'd already told the committee that endurance was a skill more programs should value. I reminded her the grant required a faculty nomination I didn't have. And she just slid the sealed envelope across the counter with a quiet, "Your work speaks for itself," while the fluorescent lights hummed above us. I carried that envelope back to my place, like something fragile after realizing she'd written my name on it in ink steady enough to counter every doubt I still couldn't shake. I met Daniel in the campus cafe when he noticed the surgical handbook open beside my untouched lunch and asked whether anyone working those hours ever remembered to breathe. And I told him breathing wasn't the problem. Stopping long enough to notice it was. He laughed while tapping the corner of my book and asked what kept me going when the load felt impossible. And the question landed differently because he wasn't trying to fix anything, only trying to see me. I walked out of that cafe, realizing someone had finally looked past the exhaustion and caught the part of me that had refused to break even when everything else around it had. The trauma doors burst open with the paramedics calling out unstable vitals while pushing Morgan toward the bay. And my resident leaned close with a tense. The splenic window looks bad as I moved beside the gurney and told anesthesia to stand by for an emergent transfer. A nurse asked whether I wanted a second attending because the patient shared my last name, and I kept my eyes on the monitor while answering that the only thing that mattered was securing a line before her pressure bottomed out. Someone asked about family contact, and I stepped over the note that had fallen earlier and told them the call would be made. Though Morgan's own handwriting under the words "call only if necessary" was still sharp in my mind. When we reached the hallway, leading to the OR, two voices rose from the waiting area, with Richard demanding to speak to the surgeon responsible and Linda telling him to calm down until someone gave them information. Their words carrying the familiar edge that used to end every disagreement at home. My charge nurse glanced at me as Richard insisted that the chief come out immediately. And I walked forward while adjusting my gloves, just as his gaze dropped to the badge, clipped to my scrubs with the name he had once erased from every family conversation. Linda touched his arm with a shaken Riley, and his mouth opened around a question that never formed because the intake tablet still in my hand displayed Morgan's imaging. The evidence that pulled me back to the reason I stood there at all. I told them their daughter was critically injured and needed surgery now. And Richard tried to step closer with a strained, "How long have you been here?" while Linda's eyes filled as she whispered, "You're the one." They paged, as if the timeline itself refused to settle. I reminded them that the OR was prepped and that anything unrelated to the case would have to wait. And Richard straightened with a stiff, "We just want her to live," as though the years between us hadn't carved out the distance, he suddenly noticed. Linda reached toward my arm with a trembling, "Let us know the moment you can." And the echo of that request sat heavy, because the last message I'd sent them had been returned unopened in her handwriting. The scrub tech opened the OR doors and signaled that the team was ready. And I gave anesthesia the go-ahead, while the residents positioned themselves for rapid sequence induction. As the table began to move, Richard called after me with a raw please. "She's all we have." The words cracking through the corridor just as the doors slid shut behind us. I turned toward the sterile field, knowing those same words had once been thrown like a boundary that kept me out. And the weight of his voice pressed against the moment I picked up the scalpel and focused only on the body I had sworn to save. Richard and Linda were already standing outside the ICU glass wall when the charge nurse waved me over. And Richard pressed a hand to the railing while asking whether the surgery meant she was safe now. His voice catching on the word safe, as if it had to push through everything he'd thrown at me before. Linda stepped closer with a quiet, "Tell us what we're facing," because the team wouldn't answer us. And I kept my gaze steady while explaining that Morgan was stable for the moment, but her recovery would depend on how she responded to the next 24 hours. Richard exhaled shakily with a strained, "We had no idea it was this bad." And the line hit harder than I expected, because the last envelope they sent me back had carried his handwriting across the seal like a warning. When I brought them inside, Linda gripped the foot of the bed with a whispered, "She looks so small," as the ventilator hissed behind her. And Richard braced himself with an uncertain how long had she been bleeding before anyone found her while watching the monitors track her pressure. I told them the paramedics estimated a significant delay between the crash and the 911 call. And Richard's shoulders tightened while murmuring she wouldn't have waited that long unless she was scared. The kind of sentence that used to land on my shoulders whenever he chose the version of events that made sense to him. Linda touched the edge of the blanket with a trembling she was on her way to meet us. Riley. And the weight of her voice settled against the memory of the returned letter that had asked me not to write again. The attending from trauma stepped into the room to update me on the labs. And Richard caught the door before it closed. With a tense, "We found something in her car," while looking between me and the nurse. Linda pulled a folded sheet from her bag with a hesitant, "We didn't know if it mattered until now." And when she opened it, the handwriting was unmistakably Morgan's above the line if anything happens. "Tell Riley the truth." The ink uneven, as though written during the drive. Richard stared at the page with a shaken, "She kept this from us," while trying to understand what truth she meant. And Linda's breath fractured as she whispered, "She didn't trust us enough to give this to anyone else." I took the note from them because the edges were beginning to curl under their hands, and Richard watched me read it with an unsteady "We thought she imagined all of it." Riley. But maybe she'd been trying to warn someone before she lost control of the situation. Linda wiped her cheek as she added, "She never stopped checking on you." Not once. And the silence that followed carried every year they'd spent believing the version of Morgan who had rewritten me out of the family. The monitor beeped softly as her pressure held steady. And in that sound, Richard's voice broke around the words, "We should have listened to both of you before any of this went this far." Richard and Linda followed me into the consultation alcove just outside the ICU, and Richard gripped the edge of the counter with a strained, "We want to fix this. Riley, whatever it takes." His voice catching as if the plea had been waiting behind his ribs for years. Linda stepped closer with a hushed, "We can't lose both our daughters in different ways." And I steadied myself long enough to tell them that anything moving forward would require boundaries they had never honored before. Richard nodded too quickly with a tense, "We'll do anything you ask." But the way his hands trembled made it clear he hadn't yet understood the weight of what I was about to set down. I told them the first condition was simple: no more narratives built behind closed doors. And Richard's face tightened when I added that their decisions had been shaped by whatever Morgan fed them without a moment spent verifying the truth. Linda's breath hitched with a soft, "We thought we were protecting her." And I answered that protection never required erasing someone else to make the story cleaner. Richard let out a raw, "We failed you in ways we didn't see." And the memory of the returned envelope between us pressed forward with a clarity I couldn't soften. The second boundary landed heavier when I told them they would not contact me outside medical updates until Morgan stabilized. And Linda whispered that she didn't want distance anymore. She wanted honesty. The same word that had once been used to corner me into silence. I reminded them that honesty comes with accountability. And Richard's shoulders sagged as he murmured that he was ready to face every part of what he ignored. The admission unraveling in him as though the years had finally run out of excuses. Linda reached for the note, still folded in my pocket with a broken, "We didn't know she wrote that for you." And I kept my hand firm over it, because some truths didn't need to be shared until the person who wrote them woke up. When I told them the last boundary, that my life outside this hospital was not up for negotiation anymore, Richard steadied himself, before asking what it meant for all of us if Morgan recovered. His voice thin, with a fear he couldn't quite hide. I answered that recovery didn't rewrite history. And Linda whispered that they were willing to rebuild from nothing if that was what it took to earn a place that wasn't based on someone else's version of me. Richard nodded with a quiet, "We'll wait for your lead." Riley. And the room settled into a fragile stillness as the monitor down the hall beeped steadily, marking the first moment in years where the silence between us carried terms they finally understood. The statewide medical gala opened with a low sweep of music as I stepped into the hall, and Dr. Helena Ward caught my arm with a warm, "You finally look like someone who isn't carrying the world alone," while glancing toward the stage where my name waited on the program. Daniel joined us with a quiet, "I saved you a seat before anyone else could claim it." And the small grin he gave me settled more gently than the applause rising around us. When the coordinator approached to usher me backstage, Helena murmured, "Tonight isn't about what you survived. It's about who you became." And the truth of it followed me all the way to the curtain. Standing behind the podium lights, I caught sight of Richard and Linda entering the hall with careful steps. And Richard's voice reached me in a low, "We didn't come to interrupt your world. We came to witness it," as he paused near the back rather than claiming a table up front. Linda touched his arm with a whispered, "She deserves this night without us taking space we haven't earned." And the restraint in her posture matched the boundaries I'd set in the ICU with every word laid bare. When the announcer called my name and the room rose in a steady wave, the weight of their presence settled without touching the ground I had rebuilt under my own hands. After the presentation, Daniel found me near the balcony doors with a gentle "You stood up there," like someone who finally knows where she's going. And I let the moment breathe before answering that it felt different to stand as the person I chose rather than the one I spent years trying to prove. Helena joined us with a soft, "Your work did this, Riley," not the pain that preceded it. And her certainty landed with the quiet force of someone who had watched me stitch myself back together piece by piece. When I looked across the hall and saw Richard and Linda still keeping their distance while honoring the terms I'd set, the path forward unfolded with a clarity that no longer asked me to shrink or bend, only to step fully into the life I had claimed. Tonight leaves me holding a quiet kind of gratitude, the kind that settles in after choosing a life that finally fits. And I hope you felt a piece of your own strength moving with mine through every turn. If this story reached you in any way, stay a little longer and share what part stayed with you. I'm grateful you were here with me.